Okay, let me ask you a question that honestly most people never seriously think about. What exactly would you learn about life if you had killed over 60 men in single combat and never lost once? What would you understand about reality, about human nature, about the actual mechanics of conflict and victory that the rest of us who have never faced mortal stakes could not possibly grasp? Well, today we're looking at the distilled wisdom of someone who faced this exact question head-on. Miyamoto Musashi, arguably the greatest swordsman in Japanese history.
His actual timeline proves we aren't just talking about abstract theory here. This is battle-tested survival. Look at this. At age 13, he fights his first duel and kills a trained adult samurai. By his late 20s, he's won over 60 duels, often against multiple opponents or guys who were considered famous masters. Then, at the very end of his life, at age 62, he isolates himself in a cave and writes down everything he figured out in the Book of Five Rings. Every single principle he teaches was validated in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable, literally fighting for his life.
So, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're decoding 17th century sword logic and turning it into actionable strategies for modern, high-stakes environments. We're going to look way past the literal sword fighting to see what Musashi can teach us about strategy, psychology, and seeing reality clearly, when hesitation literally means failure.
Here is our roadmap for decoding the text today. 1. Ultimate testing ground. 2. Ground book, foundations. 3. Water book, adaptability. 4. Limitations of the way. And 5. Modern applications.
All right, section 1, the ground book, foundations.
So right out of the gate in the ground book, Musashi establishes this foundation of absolute, ruthless pragmatism. It's really fascinating. For him, the sole purpose of strategy is just to win, period. It's not about looking elegant, it's not about following tradition, and it's certainly not about showing loyalty to a specific school of thought. He's basically saying if a technique doesn't work under real, messy conditions, it's totally useless. It makes you think about your own life, right? What capabilities or assets are you just leaving on the table simply because convention or habit tells you not to use them?
And this next idea brilliantly illustrates one of his most profound points. Your everyday baseline and your high-stakes performance state, they need to be exactly identical. Determined though calm, settled spirit. It's exactly the same for both. If you're someone who needs to meditate for an hour or chug 3 energy drinks to get hyped up for a big presentation or negotiation, well, Musashi would say you aren't actually prepared. True mastery means being just as effective whether the stakes are incredibly high or completely mundane. The absolute goal is to make your combat mindset your normal, everyday mindset, so there is zero transition required when the pressure suddenly hits.
Section 2, the water book, adaptability.
So, Musashi uses water as his metaphor here because, think about it, water flawlessly adapts to whatever container you put it in. It takes the exact shape of its vessel, but keeps its essential, powerful nature. And a massive part of this physical and mental fluidity is what he calls the twofold gaze. The big takeaway here is cultivating your peripheral awareness, because in combat, if you fixate on just one single detail, like your opponent's sword, you create a massive blind spot that'll get you killed. Translate that to modern terms. If you get tunnel vision on one specific issue in a negotiation, you're going to miss other lucrative possibilities. Or if a business leader obsesses over just one competitor, they might completely overlook a brand new emerging market threat. This modern concept of broad awareness is actually anchored right in his original text. He says, "Perception is strong and sight weak. It is important to see distant things as if they were close, and to take a distanced view of close things. You have to deliberately widen your visual and strategic field. You need to be able to see the entire board while still attending to the fine details. Narrowing your focus is just a massive vulnerability."
Building on that idea of avoiding vulnerability, he drops this incredibly direct rule. You should not have a favorite weapon. Why? Well, because clinging to a favorite tool or a specific technique or even a preferred management style totally limits your versatility. If you have a favorite solution, you are inevitably going to try and force it onto problems where it just doesn't fit. True adaptation means letting go of those preferences and responding with whatever tool the actual situation demands.
Which brings us to a concept he calls the spirit of the thing. This is all about maintaining total emotional consistency. Basically, your internal state shouldn't fluctuate just because external circumstances change. Whether you're facing a massive industry giant or a tiny startup, whether you're winning or losing, your spirit has to stay constant. Like we talked about earlier, needing special conditions to perform at your peak is a huge weakness. Now, this doesn't mean you turn into an unfeeling robot. You might absolutely feel fear or excitement, but the key is that you treat those emotions as information, not commands. You act appropriately regardless.
And that brings us to a pretty profound and frankly uncomfortable truth. You can only fight the way you practice. Under real pressure, you don't magically rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your training. Whatever habits and patterns you've reinforced during low-stakes practice, that is exactly what's going to emerge when the stakes get real. If your practice isn't strictly aligned with how you need to perform under pressure, you are literally actively training yourself to fail.
Section 3. Limitations of the way.
Now, as powerful as Musashi's ideas are, they were obviously forged in a very specific, ruthless context. So we need to objectively look at some of the strategic blind spots here. First off, his entire framework is heavily focused on zero-sum conflict. Someone has to lose for him to win. But in modern society and modern business, collaboration often yields way better results than pure competition. Treating absolutely everything as a life-or-death fight is just exhausting and inefficient. Second, expecting 100% emotional regulation, probably not entirely realistic by modern psychological standards. And finally, we have to acknowledge a massive potential for survivorship bias. Yes, Musashi won all his duels and wrote a brilliant book, but we literally have no data on how many other people applied the exact same philosophy and simply didn't survive to write about it. So we evaluate what's useful and we discard the rest.
All right, Section 4, Modern Strategic Applications.
Let's translate this life or death logic into practical everyday tools that you can actually use. We've distilled his philosophy down into 3 concrete practices for you to implement this week.
Here's your roadmap. Step 1. The expanded gaze exercise. Several times a day, try to deliberately widen your visual field. Stop fixating on your screen or just one object, and try to take in your entire environment peripherally. Notice what you were missing. Step 2. The stable spirit audit. For the next week, track your emotional states. Notice if you only perform well when you quote-unquote feel like it. Because if you rely on perfect conditions to do good work, you've just identified a massive vulnerability that you need to fix. And step 3, the practice alignment check. Pick just one high-stakes area of your life. Are you practicing for it the exact way you will need to perform? If there's a gap between your practice conditions and your performance conditions, close it immediately.
I want to leave you with this final thought to really reflect on today. Take a hard look at how you operate when nobody is watching, when the pressure is completely off. Are your habits in those low-stakes situations actually training you to fail when it matters most? Because as Musashi proved over an entire lifetime of survival, the way you practice today dictates whether you will prevail tomorrow.
Here is our roadmap for decoding all this philosophy. 1. The foundation of mastery. 2. The fire book, engagement. 3. Navigating the critical fords. 4. The wind book, anticipation. 5. The void book, emptiness. And finally, 6. Modern samurai practices.
All right, Section 1, the foundation of mastery, bridging the internal and the external.
The jump from his earlier writings perfectly illustrates how Musashi completely shifts gears. In Part 1, the Ground and Water books, the focus was entirely internal. It was about developing a stable spirit and mastering your own technical fundamentals. But here in Part 2, with the Fire, Wind, and Void books, the focus violently shifts outward. He moves from training the self to actively engaging with the enemy and the much broader competitive landscape.
Moving on to Section 2, the Fire Book, Engagement, Controlling the Flow of Conflict.
Fire is all about initiative, and Musashi identifies 3 distinct types. First up is Ken no Sen. This is your straightforward aggression, attacking first to set the terms of the engagement. Second is Tai no Sen, which is waiting patiently to draw out your opponent's attack and then countering it. And third is Tai Tai no Sen, a simultaneous mutual attack. But here is the real secret, right? Rather than having a favorite strategy, the master has to be completely comfortable with all 3 of these approaches. Having a preference literally limits your options. You must deploy whichever initiative fits the exact circumstance, whether you're sitting in a boardroom or standing on a literal battlefield.
Beyond just taking the initiative, Musashi actually teaches us how to induce a total collapse in an opponent. And what's wonderfully counterintuitive here is his specific method for doing it.
I mean, think about it. Conventional wisdom always tells us to match our opponent's energy. If a negotiation gets super heated, we naturally tend to speed up, right? But Musashi introduces this wild inversion. When they are agitated, you slow down. When they are sluggish and complacent, you attack with blazing speed. By doing the exact opposite of what their energy suggests, you completely refuse to play their game. You turn their agitation or their comfort into a fatal vulnerability, completely disrupting their rhythm.
Section 3. Navigating the critical fords. Mastering transition points. He uses this incredibly vivid metaphor of a ford. In nature, a ford is a narrow, shallow part of a river where you can safely cross. Strategically, though, it represents the moment of maximum risk, but also maximum opportunity in absolutely any conflict or transition.
Thinking about how this plays out chronologically, you always have your preparation phase, but eventually you're going to hit stage 2, the ford. The ford is that unavoidable pinch point in a negotiation, a major career shift, or a product launch, where the stakes are at their absolute highest. It demands the utmost internal calm to navigate successfully without drowning. Panic at the ford leads to utter disaster. Clarity leads to a safe crossing.
But what happens when you get totally bogged down at the ford? Musashi offers this bizarre, yet totally brilliant visual to force cognitive flexibility, the rat's head and the ox's neck.
The rat has a tiny head, which represents hyperfocus on specific, granular details. The ox, on the other hand, has a massive neck, representing broad, powerful strategic action. So the absolutely crucial point here is that when you find yourself entangled in the minutiae, say arguing over a single little clause in a contract, you must instantly snap back to that broad perspective. You have to shift fluidly back and forth between the rat and the ox to break the mental deadlock.
Section 4. The Win Book. Anticipation. Studying other schools.
Here, Musashi ruthlessly critiques other martial arts schools, but not just to be mean. He does it to show exactly how over-optimization creates a predictable vulnerability. For instance, a school relying on an overly long sword definitely gains reach, but they become totally helpless the absolute second they step into a narrow hallway. Over-indexing on one single strength always leaves your defense wide open.
This right here is the absolute essence of strategic intelligence. If you truly understand how your opponent fights from the inside out, if you know their underlying principles and not just their techniques, you can easily set traps and neutralize their strengths because their actions become entirely predictable. You know exactly what they will do before they even do it.
Section 5. The Void Book. Emptiness. The ultimate dimension of mastery. After mastering the environment, the opponent, and all your techniques, we really have to ask this ultimate question. What state of mind actually remains when all deliberate, conscious calculations just vanish?
Musashi writes this hauntingly beautiful line about the void. Now, I know this sounds deeply mystical, but he is actually pointing directly to the ultimate pinnacle of practical, battle-tested expertise. Modern psychology actually calls this state flow, or in Zen Buddhism, it's known as mushin, no mind. The void isn't some magical shortcut, guys. It is the automaticity that only emerges after literally decades of relentless practice. It's the experienced doctor diagnosing a patient in a single glance, or the veteran negotiator sensing the absolute perfect moment to close a deal. The technique is absorbed so completely into your being that it just disappears, and your action becomes completely spontaneous.
Section 6. Modern Samurai Practices. Applying the Advanced Books.
Let's break this down into 3 steps you can apply right now. First up, an initiative inventory. Just stop for a second and ask if your default reaction to conflict is actually the best one, or if it's just a habit. Second, opponent modeling. Step into the Wind Book and spend 30 minutes looking at a conflict entirely through your adversary's fears and constraints. Put yourself in their shoes. Finally, an automaticity assessment. Figure out what core skills still require your conscious thought and relentlessly drill them into the void. By systematically running through these 3 practices, you bring 17th century wisdom directly into your modern boardroom or creative process.
Because ultimately, mastery isn't a physical place you just arrive at and pack your bags. As Musashi makes crystal clear, you can only fight the way you practice, and going through this explainer together is really merely the starting line.
The wisdom in the Book of 5 Rings has been tested under the ultimate, highest-stakes mortal conditions imaginable. The only remaining variable in all of this is your own dedication. The path begins with your very next action. Will you take it?